Welcome to the next installation of Seize the Mean September. 4 months ago, which feels like 84 years ago, my world was turned upside down. Like millions of Americans, I found myself unemployed and unsure of the future. While I've since returned to work, millions of Americans remain unemployed. Unable to earn an income, Americans hoping for relief were promptly told to go fuck themselves. Actually, some received $1,200 and were expected to survive on that for months. That amount doesn't even cover 2 months' rent for many working people. Landlords, being the parasites they are, continue to try and collect rent without any regard for their tenants' financial struggles. So tenants began to organize themselves and organize rent strikes. A rent strike is where tenants refuse to pay rent to a landlord until their demands are met. In times like these, it feels like we need to declare war against landlords. Which brings us to the topic of this video. That time upstate New Yorkers brought about land reform by resisting patroons. Right, let's somewhat quickly go over the Patron System. Without going into too much detail, it was originally started by the Dutch West India Company. Not these cats. These cats. During the 17th century in order to get people to settle in New Netherland. This system was outlined in the Charter of Freedoms and Exemptions. Basically, a patroon would attempt to convince 50 people to settle his patroonship, and if he was successful, this would become his manor, which gave him a lot of privileges. The patroon owned the land, collected rent from the settlers who were now his tenants, created both civil and criminal courts, appointed officials, and could own slaves. Tenant farmers could work and improve the land, but had no right to it and were not allowed to leave unless the patroon allowed them to. Patroons were also allowed to pass down the patroonship to their descendants. I know what you're thinking. Wait a second, this sounds like feudalism. And yeah, it basically was, with extra steps. This system naturally attracted some wealthy individuals who wanted to do a colonialism and a feudalism at the same time, but many of them failed. For instance, one Samuel Godin attempted to set up a patroonship, but indigenous peoples killed all of his settlers, so he gave up. In the end, some were moderately successful, but only one guy really stood out from the rest, Kilian van Rensselaer. Rensselaer's manor, Rensselaerswyck, was created in 1630 and by far the most profitable of these manors, surviving another 200 years and bringing us to the topic of this video. By the 1830s, what remained of the patroon system was basically large estates where tenant farmers paid rent to the patroon. In Rensselaerswyck, the tenants of patroon Kilian van Rensselaer's descendant, Stephen van Rensselaer III, found him to be seemingly less of a feudal parasite. Rensselaer was described as lenient by his tenants, allowing them to pay him a fraction of the rent owed when they couldn't afford it. Tenants benefited from this leniency after the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 and the Panic of 1837 as wheat prices fell. Wheat was one of the staple crops tenants used to feed themselves and pay rent. This leniency ended abruptly in January of 1839 when Stephen van Rensselaer III died and his debt passed on to his descendants. According to some sources, Rensselaer's will told his descendants to collect back rent to cover his debt. However, the tenants were unable to repay their debts in such a short amount of time. They tried to negotiate with Stephen van Rensselaer IV, but he refused to meet with them to discuss a possible resolution, and the courts within Rensselaerswyck refused to give them any relief. Facing property seizure or eviction and left with no other options, the tenants within the patroonship chose to organize and revolt against the repressive system. One anti-renter handbill read,
"Attention, anti-renters, awake, arouse, strike till the last armed foe expires, strike for your altars and your fires, strike for the green graves of your sires, God in your happy homes."
On July 4th, 1839, they met in Nassau, New York, issuing their own Declaration of Independence.
"We will take up the ball of the revolution where our fathers stopped it and roll it to the final consummation of freedom and independence of the masses."
Rensselaer's descendants organized a posse of hundreds of men led by Albany County Sheriff Michael Archer in December of 1839 in order to confiscate and auction off the livestock of renters who could not afford rent. The tenants confronted the posse and successfully repelled them. It wasn't long before this movement spread to other patroonships in New York. In response to this, Governor William Seward, yes, the Alaska Purchase guy, sent in the state militia and dispersed the crowd. What followed for the next few years was a resistance movement of varying tactics. Anti-renter communities created their own newspapers, organized meetings, and combined their resources to support themselves. They also dressed up as indigenous peoples and called themselves Calico Indians, sabotaging efforts to evict renters. This was a reference to the Boston Tea Party, where some of the demonstrators had dressed up as indigenous peoples. Tin horns, which had been used to call workers in for dinner, were used to signal the Calico Indians to attack. They killed, auctioned off livestock, destroyed legal documents, vandalized the property of the law enforcement, and even tarred and feathered representatives of the patroon. Two prominent leaders of the strike were Ange de Vere, an Irish immigrant who had protested land reform in the UK, and Dr. Smith Boughton, a doctor who dressed up as a Calico Indian, calling himself Big Thunder. Yeah, all of the members of this group used faux indigenous names like Big Lion, Black Hawk, Red Wing, Pompey, and Thunderbolt. Anyway, in 1844, Smith A. Boughton was jailed for months for his suspected involvement in a theft of legal documents. Anti-renters found his leadership so important to the movement that they threatened to break him out of jail. Smith was eventually tried and convicted of another crime and sentenced to life in prison, though his sentence was later commuted. The anti-renters also organized themselves politically by voting landlords out of elected positions and creating an anti-rent political party. Because so many tenants from Rensselaerswyck and the other patroonships in eastern New York supported land reform, they were able to create a political organization that rivaled the Whigs and the Democrats, the two prominent political parties of the time. In response, both parties incorporated anti-rent positions into their platforms. Legislators, sympathetic to the anti-renters, added clauses like forbidding quarter sales and limiting future lease to no more than 12 years to the New York Constitution of 1846. That same year, John Young was nominated as the Whig candidate for governor of New York. He supported both land reform and the anti-renters. Young took office as governor of New York in 1847 and under his term, investigated the clauses of the patroonships within the Catskills region and pardoned most of the tenants who had resisted the enforcement of the Patron System. Further reforms in the late 1840s abolished the rent tenure system, and many patroons chose to sell their land to their tenants or convert their leases to legal ones. Over the course of the late 1840s and early 1850s, the Rensselaers sold their rights to the tenants. In the end, anti-renters were able to abolish the Patron System and replace it with a considerably less oppressive system. Many tenants finally owned their own land, but interestingly enough, many believed that reforms had not gone far enough and would later settle out west. This naturally brings us into the larger topic of land reform in the working class, but that's out of the scope of this video and will be covered in the future. Back in the present day, any sort of future anti-rent war to abolish rent altogether and house the millions of needlessly houseless people across the world will most likely begin with tenant unions and other similar organizations. The organizations that we create today to protest how landlords and politicians alike are handling renters affected by coronavirus have the potential to build the foundation for greater societal change. Join a tenants union in your area or create one if one does not already exist. Organize. The anti-renters showed us it's possible to bring about reforms and even revolution through resistance. Let's become modern anti-renters. But we're not going to dress up as indigenous peoples. I would like to thank Ellie Dawson for lending her beautiful and charismatic voice to this project. Ellie is also a content creator and you should check out her videos. If you love history like me, then you'll love her video on American anarchist Voltaire de Cleyre. Or if media analysis is more your thing, you'll love her video Full Metal Alchemist State and Revolution. You can find the links in the description. I would also like to thank the Potato Witch for the amazing title card. It really captures the diversity of working people and the different types of occupations relevant to today's working class. Links to his Twitter and thread list below. Thanks for watching, but September is nowhere near complete. Next week we're going to celebrate the anniversary of a strike. I'll see you then for the next installation of Seize the Mean September.